We're now joined by two people who are in the middle of radical paradigm shifts, in fact, are involved in making these happen. John Clippinger and Dale Dougherty and I met at a lovely annual event in Jackson Hole where about 90 of us just get together and talk about the future, and it's kind of neat. Mostly people far more qualified to do that, like John and Dale. I guess I'm that academic outlier that they tossed in the middle. John has, among other things, been recently focused on blockchain. I'll let him explain this phenomenon to you and how it is relevant for all of us here in the audience today. John, join us on stage. Great. Thanks a lot. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Well, it's a real privilege and a pleasure to be here. And a lot of people speak of the blockchain as sort of a shorthand for a highly transformative decentralization of services and institutions, and is linked to the Bitcoin. And I'm not going to talk about Bitcoin so much. I'm really going to focus on the concept of the blockchain, the ability to take basically decentralized authorities and use cryptographic proofs as a way of creating trust, what some people call trustless systems, so you don't have to rely upon institutions or third parties. And in doing that, you actually can have a massive change in how services, and particularly financial services, but anything that requires trust and risk, how those can be authenticated and what new kinds of authorities can be created around it. So it's a fundamental change. But before I do that, I think you've got to put it in the context. And the context is that when we think of data, we generally think of data as a set of observations. We're looking out, we're looking down, we're looking in. And a lot of the privacy rules and regulations have been based on that notion, that the damages or the harms come if you have the inappropriate collection of data. But actually what we're doing, we're moving into an immersive world where data is more like water. It's something that is an essential input into a whole set of devices and processes. And so actually to stop the flow of data, to inhibit it, to have say, a notification and consent, which is a typical privacy intervention, is almost like a denial of service attack. We're creating a lot of dependencies on data. And so when you have the mobile phone and you think about your ability to do open table, or do meetups, or actually do ride-hailing services, or anything like Google Maps, is totally dependent upon the sharing of that data. And so we really have to rethink it because we're immersed in it. And it's not an observation looking down. We're in it. It's a critical input. And our institutions and our regulations are really locked into this old way of thinking about things. So when you think about data, it's not just sharing pictures or files. It actually becomes a new kind of asset. And the question is, how can you provenance that asset? How do you know where it came from? How true do you know what it is? And who controls it? And so when we're virtualizing things in the physical world into a digital world. And we're creating an alternative ecology. And we're opening up huge opportunities to do things much more differently at scale, much more efficiently and effectively. And so the question comes, who controls that asset? And it's a real issue, say in the military case where you have an asset or a drone, you say, when push comes to shove, do I control it? How do I know I control it? Who tells me I can control it? So this question about authority and authentication becomes very, very important. And so, unfortunately, our ways of thinking about authorities and our ways of thinking about ourselves and how we derive our identities and how we think of what we're entitled to or not entitled, all our classifications of what we are based upon very static hierarchical notions, from our lineage system or caste system to the medieval chain of being. Every person, and you can look at universities that way as well, that mimic the sort of the medieval model. So you have, no, but it's true. You have your bishops and your princes and all these, and you have to make appropriate gestures. But I divert. Okay, I'm moving on. I think I made my point. So So one of the things that you have these identities, and how you're defined depends what access you have to resources. So how life-defining a passport is. And then, the far right, and the inscrutable, those are indulgences. So it seems to be any place that authority can create a choke point, then they insert themselves and generate some revenue. And so so this is like endemic to the human condition. So it can be social register, it can be Berks, peerage, it can be credit scores, and whoever does that, he enrolls, controls. So that's a very, very profound kind of thing, and yet it's locked in a very sort of archaic structure. And right now we say who the new authorities are. I mean, you have the banks, you have the governments, and then you have the Google twins, or you have Zuckerberg. You have these, by de facto, Facebook is taking over a lot of these authentication roles, providing the identity structures, and by virtue of that, being able to deny or provide access to certain kinds of resources. And this is sort of happenstance, but it's happening at a global scale. Governments are having a hard time coming to terms with that. They say, well, really, should Facebook be an identity provider? No, we think we should be. And there's a whole school of thinking, no, actually, just even outside the government. The work that we've done is a whole notion of self-sovereign identity, self-sovereign data. It's in a protocol. It's not in a government institution or a bank or a telecom operator. And so this is where Bitcoin comes in, and really the blockchain comes in, because it provides a new kind of decentralization of authority. And we can go into the details of it and how it was invented, but it's a distributed ledger, a database, and it has little scripts on top of it, like business rules. And what it does, when it's presented with some piece of data, it basically can sign it and stamp it in time, and put it on the blockchain in what they call create a public key that's inspectable. And so what you can have is you don't have to have a person in the loop. You don't have to have a physical presence. It's all in the algorithm. And so it's what people, the most extreme view is it's sort of trustless trust. You don't have to trust anyone. It's all in the algorithm. And that's sort of the dream of how the blockchain could work. And there's a lot of, so when you start talking about the blockchain, you also start talking about smart contracts. And a smart contract is basically a program that executes a set of rules. And having done it, then it's signed and put on the blockchain, so anyone can inspect to see whether that particular thing, that particular transaction was valid. And you can do more complex things. You can pull resources and have the blockchain control the release of funds given a certain condition that happens. And again, that's being signed. So there are lots of use cases where people are looking for, from being able to create blockchains, create a whole set of services, microservices, that use it, have smart contracts that eliminate a huge amount of friction. And it's quasi-anonymous. It's not totally anonymous. You can mine and analyze the public keys, and you can make some inferences about who's involved. But the problem is that there's a lot of contention right now in the community, because there's the Bitcoin blockchain, there's the Ethereum blockchain, using something called Ether. They both have something called a proof of stake and proof of work consensus algorithms. There are challenges to that because arguably, there's like 80% of the mining, and that's the computation required to do a proof of work, say for Bitcoin, is done in China. So it's a very good concentration. And so it's supposed to be wholly decentralized, but it's not really in fact. And you get into a lot of religious discussions about these issues that you don't want to do on the internet. Because people are less inhibited. But then, so what's happening now is that you have banks and large financial entities doing experiments where they're setting up these consortiums to actually say, well, if we'll create our own blockchain, and it's going to be a private blockchain, and it's going to be on a permitted rather than permissionless basis. That means that not anyone can do the mining, not anyone can join. Well, that's real heresy. In terms of if you're a Bitcoin fanatic, that's just like selling out to the devil. But that is really where it's going. And you try to develop, how do you create these private blockchains, permitted blockchains, in a way that they don't get captured by any one particular party? And this becomes a key problem. And it's really a problem of the commons. And where you have a resource that everyone benefits from, and you can't let one person exploit it. So you have the classic tragedy of the commons. And how do you solve that problem? Because you've got this data, you want it to flow, but you don't want it to be contaminated. Flint, Michigan. You have the whole problem of if data is like water, and it should flow, and it's life-giving to everyone in an ecology, someone can't hoard it, they can't divert it, they can't pollute it. It really has to be, it all has to be shared fairly by all. And so there's Elinor Ostrom. I don't know how many people know Elinor Ostrom here, but she's a Nobel laureate in economics, the only one, and she developed the rules for how you manage a commons. And so and she looked at traditional societies in doing so, and she came up with 8 principles. Now, she wasn't thinking of the digital world. I mean, we talked to her about this. I mean, she was not a digital type person. But she was able to abstract out various principles that actually are quite applicable. And what I would be arguing here, and the point to make, is that you really need a network of networks, just as the internet is a network of networks. There's not a monolithic network. And it's really a data commons of reciprocal, what I call reciprocal relationships. So it's rather than having where the Bitcoin is based on basically a premise of rivalry, it's a zero-sum game. Commons is a collaborative. It's a different kind of game mechanics and a different kind of incentive mechanisms. And you're also using, rather than using proof of work, which is very costly. I mean, if the Bitcoin was fully scaled in current technology, it would cook the planet, because it's basically, it consumes energy in order to do proofs of work. It's just not feasible. So you have to have a lighter mechanism for doing proofs, and a secure one that no one can capture. And I think what you're going to find is, in creating these consortiums, is that there's a transition to a new kind of thinking that is not so much rivalrous, but is collaborative, that builds on a commons, that everyone can derive value from it. And that is a sort of a different model. And I think what we're finding, and this is keyed into some conversations that we had this morning on automation of knowledge and AI, is that as you have more and more devices out there consuming data, being data-driven, and in the Internet of Things, they can be smart contracts, they can be a drone, an autonomous drone. We're delegating more authority to the device itself. I mean, where the extreme example of this is, that I just read recently, is that there's a new submarine, class of submarine, that has 24 missiles that's totally autonomous. So we're making a big bet. And so, yeah, you have a submarine, it hasn't come up, it's just, okay, it makes the decisions. We'll see. No. So they may put a human loop in somewhere, but that is the design parameter. But you're going to see that in weapons as well. So the drones, the G-forces in drones, people can't tolerate that. And at some point, it gets sufficiently complex that you're going to depend upon the device. So I'd like to end with a little bit of a provocation here, and that is the sort of what happens when you have autonomous governance technologies, because that's sort of the direction that you're looking at the blockchain. And so is it like governance without governments? It's a kind of technology. You design a set of mechanics that performs in a certain way. It's provably performs that way. So we don't need the traditional notion of government, people in that loop. You can have authorization without people authorities. Again, it's just a set of algorithms. There could be rules, there could be regulations we all agree to. And then the whole adjudication. I mean, what you're seeing in this process, when you can start to do verification and automation of contracts, you can see the impact on the whole legal industry. Before I was at MIT, I was at Harvard Law School, and we were at something called the Law Lab, and we built contracts that were self-executing and then used genetic algorithms to create better contracts. It was an experiment, but you can see that's such a huge cost, the legal cost, friction, that there's certain things you can probably put in a canonical form and automate, which is to be a real good. And there are other things that maybe it's not a closed loop, that you're going to have an evolving contracts, like in common law. You're going to have something that it tries to achieve some stability points so it can evolve itself and then sign on the blockchain and verify what it's done. But this is moving in a very different world. So again, you're pulling people out of the loop, you're putting it in the algorithm, and it creates a very different way of thinking about institutions and societies and laws and participation. It's a fundamental change in how we think of our most fundamental democratic and economic institutions. So I'll leave it with that.
Thank you, John.
Sure. You go.
So hand me that.
Sure.
I have a seat on the couch.
Sure.
So that was a lot. I think at one point you mentioned I'll just provide one provocation. Was that 100 provocations, perhaps? So we'll chat about this paradigm shift, not so much the detail of blockchain, but what to expect, the experience managing through. But before we do that, I'd like to welcome Dale Dougherty to the stage in a moment. As I mentioned earlier, Dale is fundamental to the global maker movement. So this is 3D printing, but it transcends 3D printing. It's a whole range of capabilities that are becoming available to people of all ages and even all income levels around the world to make things, to create things, to envision and become entrepreneurial in this sense, to become a scientist in terms of experimentation. And Dale was fundamental to founding maker fairs, which happen all over the world, literally hundreds of thousands of people coming together around the world to make things, share solutions, problems, learn about what's possible, the art of the possible. And I'm telling more and more of my clients and friends and students who are in business, government, and other realms, they need to get to one of these fairs. They need to go and see what is happening. They need to go online and find out what people, their consumers, their customers, their partners are doing that might be relevant in their realm. So before I call Dale out, I'd like to share a quick video of one of those maker fairs. If we could cue the video.
One of the attendees at Maker Faire who made her own video of her own experiences. And I think if you were there at a Maker Faire, you'd see there were all kinds of different things that normally really aren't put together. We call it the greatest show and tell on earth, and at its heart is just this act of showing what you make and sharing it with other people. And surprisingly, people like to do it, and more surprisingly, lots of people seem to be interested. I didn't know when I started the event if we'd get anybody to come, but that was about a week and a half ago in San Mateo. It's our 11th year of doing Maker Faire there. We had 150,000 people over 2 days. We had an education day with 4,500 school children coming to check it out. And Maker Faire has developed over this period there's over 190 fairs this year around the world. We have 4 of them that are over 100,000 people, San Francisco and New York, but also Shenzhen, China, and Rome, Italy. And but a lot of them are in small towns. Last year there was a young boy, it was a high school student that went to a Maker Faire in Seattle, and he came back to a small town of Wenatchee, Washington, and he saw himself as a creative person but wasn't connecting to any of that in his town. He said, I'm going to create a Maker Faire as my senior project. And he took the community center and turned it, with his friends and schoolmates, they turned it into a community Maker Faire, got the government involved, got university involved, and had a great experience, not only producing the event, but also meeting so many people in the community. So I think of the Maker movement as kind of this possible today, or perhaps it's in many ways happening because of a certain democratization of technology. There's cheaper electronics, 3D printers, which existed but weren't really designed for average people to use, and maybe still aren't, but makers wanted their own in the way that the early personal computer builders wanted a personal computer to figure out what to do with a personal computer, not because they knew what it was good for. And but I think so. These tools are becoming more accessible. The components are cheaper, and we have things like maker spaces emerging where people can also get access to it. A tech shop in San Francisco with locations elsewhere. It's like a gym membership. You can pay money, go there, and get access, and build something that, previously you might have needed to be in business to have access to this kind of lab and sophisticated equipment. Now you can go in and prototype. And I think that a good way to think of the Maker movement is as a prototyping revolution. It's possible to take that crazy idea you have in your head and begin to work on it and develop it and then share it with other people and learn and see where that wants to go. The other thing that I think is driving, though, the Maker movement is kind of a parallel thing. If we think of the democratization of technology creating new tools for production, it's a democratization of learning that I think is running in parallel that makes it easier to learn how to use these tools and make more people capable of doing something productive with that. So when we put these two things together, we see something that I think is happening really around the globe. Governments are beginning to get interested in it. Next month we have the National Week of Making starting June 17th, I believe. I was in Brussels on Monday where we launched European Maker Week. And in October, there'll be China Maker Week happening as well. And they're all kind of different reasons that governments are getting involved in. I think some of it has to do with education. Making seems to be a gateway into the world of science and technology. And it's actually a completely different way of learning than we are offering in our schools. And this has kind of been my passion, is really bringing hands-on learning back. It's not a new idea. It's been 100 years old with John Dewey and Seymour Papert at MIT talked about it in the 70s. But it's been marginalized. It's really been almost removed from it. So kids think of, actually your textbook example, Robert's a good one. I mean, they think of science as a textbook. They don't think of it as a process, as something to get involved in. It doesn't, when you see those things up there, some of them are done by young kids who see that they can have a bit of control, that they can change things. And really, I think behind it today, as much of this has to do with creative expression. This says something about who you are and what you want to do with your life. And so I see Maker Faire as a place to collect this and to gather it, and the feedback you get and the connections you get from all of these people, seeing others who are really good, but also allowing amateurs to participate, people who are just starting out. So I think of it like you might think about sports or music. If you want a lot of really star performers at the top, you really have to invest in a community at the bottom because that's where they come from. So if we want innovation in our communities, we need to get it accessible And my view of education through making is that it's play. It's kids' play. It's child's play. And even for adults, it's the same invitation. This is fun. I'm not going in and saying, here's the pedagogy to learn how to do something. It's actually fun. And as you get challenged to do more and learn more and say, how can I get it to do that? You have access to an enormous body of information online, YouTube videos. Kids are learning today these things because they aren't dependent on their parent or teacher showing them how to do it. So I think we have an opportunity to accelerate innovation through this, but I wouldn't call it that because I don't want to judge it or think that it's only the entrepreneurs that come out of this. It's actually, I think, the kinds of problems that we want to be able to solve. And there's something wrong with our society in terms of the way institutions and governments are working that do not seem to engage people in being problem solvers. We're not really working together. The exception tends to be at the local level, where people are engaging, and surprisingly, the maker movement is very local. You need a maker space, you need tools, you need other people. And that's why there's 190 maker fairs instead of one, because bringing together, being local, having access repeatedly to these things makes a difference. So I'm gonna stop there so we can have some conversation, but let me just read the room a bit. How many of you are makers? Okay, that's a pretty good number, but I believe all of you are makers. Those of you who didn't raise your hand, I'll meet you outside and we'll have a talk. But you know, it's cooking, it's woodworking, it's robots, it's anything. But the phrase I kind of use it, you know, what I think about the Maker Faire is I want us to see ourselves as producers, not just consumers. And that's where we want to go. So, thank you. Thank you.
Dale, that was great. I think you just threatened us all to get involved. I think it was a threat. No, I'm not sure.
No, it's not a threat at all. It's an invitation.
Okay.
And but you know, it's like an RSVP. You better RSVP.
Yeah. So it's like you're giving us an invitation we can't refuse.
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
great. So speaking of that, before I go on, I want to point something out. We at the Kin are all about inclusion and breaking stereotypes. So I am proud of the fact that we have a program all about new paradigms by three old guys in sport coats. Yeah. In any case, okay. Great. Now that we got that out of the room, we can get over that. So both of you are in the middle of fundamental paradigm changes. I mean, when you threw out probably 20 different things that could have been hour-and-a-half long conversations, and in terms of this autonomous governance notion and what it can affect across business, government, society, institutions, and Dale, the possibility of doing these things when I was a kid in the 70s and the 80s. I mean, it's just mind-blowing. I remember I had a TRS-80. It was called a Trash 80. Yeah. Remember those? Yeah. We bought them at a place called Radio Shack. Who buys a computer at a shack? And it did nothing. It just had a blinking cursor. That's the only thing it did. But we were so excited. You said something exciting during your segment, and it was people were buying PCs to figure out what to do with PCs. So how do we get involved in each of your cases? And they're very different, but they have similarities. Somebody who's not a maker, somebody who hasn't been thinking from their business perspective, for instance, about blockchain. How do you even get started and get involved? And whoever wants to go first. Dale?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think there's sort of two ends of this. I think makers are as a community, an untapped source of innovation. They're already producing lots of ideas. They're very motivated to do things. And what we see companies doing, but even some government agencies, we had the Department of Energy representing 10 national labs at Maker Faire in the Bay Area. They want to engage makers in clean energy issues. And I think of it in some ways, you could say, well, what are the problem sets, like the risk profile we had earlier? Yeah. What are some of the problem sets that we need participation? We need more people thinking about them and acting on them. And I think we have a community of people that's interested. I think they're motivated by learning about things and also what they can do. So how do you break down a large problem set into components that people can act on and make a difference? The other area I'd say is education. find a makerspace in your town, find a way to support it, try to get that makerspace to help bring that into schools and libraries, which we see happening. You wouldn't believe how much a little bit of money is helpful here. This is like supplies are needed so that they can do projects in the classroom. They don't necessarily need 3D printers at elementary school. Getting this in, and I think it's one of the big wins we see is that teachers are bringing it in. This is not a top-down change that's happening, and to speak to your paradigm thing, it's one of the very few examples that anybody can think of where change is happening in education, and it's not being pushed by the Department of Education or foundations or someone else. It's kind of coming in from the rebel army, coming in the side door and saying, we want to do this. And their reason is they want to engage kids. They want to have meaningful learning going on in the classroom, and we don't have that going on today in too many places, and especially in disadvantaged neighborhoods.
Great. Thanks, Dale. John.
I think that what you're seeing is in the maker movement is actually related to this whole idea of creating sort of decentralized networks that are emergent in self-organizing, and that there's a skepticism of traditional authorities. I mean, when you look at Bitcoin, it was a response to the financial failure of the central banks, and it had that sort of libertarian element to it. But it's matured into how people can create new kinds of platforms where you can have participation and you can have to a scale. And so if you look at some, and there's such a huge amount of activity now in sort of, in Europe, in Barcelona, and Greece, how do you start to create new kinds of cooperatives that can scale and actually, they're looking at issuing their own currencies, they're creating their own new kinds of institutional structures or ways of participating. And for example, one of the areas that have been involved is in the whole mobility area of sort of ride-hailing services in San Francisco. You have Uber, and it's sort of the demand economy that's data-driven. But you have groups now that they're saying, how do we create a cooperative owned by the drivers themselves? And how do we pay them, and how do we raise money for them? So it's a decentralized global cooperative and you can do that at scale. You can do it in a legal framework. And there's even a group that set up what they call their own DAO, and they raised $150 million in 25 days. And they had an issuance. They sold.
This was the Ether.
It's the Ether. That's right.
Yeah.
It's the Ether.
Can you explain briefly what that was?
Well, what it was is I mentioned earlier, there are two kinds of blockchains. There's the Bitcoin blockchain, there's the Ether blockchain. The Ether blockchain is more oriented towards having smart contracts and being able to design new kinds of cooperative structures. And so there's a whole ecosystem in which people are reinventing everything. It's like, it's a very much of a bottom-up. And one of the things they wanted to do was raise a lot of money. One group called Slack was in Europe that wanted to have smart contracts, decentralized systems control the Internet of Things. So they got together and they built a program. There's a smart contract. And they said anyone who buys these Ether tokens, and they can have, we'll raise a pool of money, and then we'll vote to decide how we allocate the money. So it's a way of capitalizing something and competing with traditional venture sources. I mean, there are issues to it. They're probably selling security. They're probably going to get sued. Yeah. And so there's some downside there. Yeah. But it is the beginning. And you got to have courage, right? They have all sorts of disclaimers. The programmers say, we're not liable, and the regulators say, well, I don't know about that. Yeah. But I think we'll evolve through that. And so there's a new kind of order, a new kind of social order that's coming out of this.
Yeah. Emergent. Go ahead,
Dale. I was just going to say, that's what I find, in some ways, what's the connection between what we're doing? And it is this sort of self-organizing, distributed thing. But there's value creation happening here that's not, it's not fitting into that hierarchical structure.
That's right.
And there's something emergent here that, either new kinds of institutions will form to take advantage of it, or new kinds of technologies will be plugged into kind of help this along somehow.
Sure, this is going off, but how do you, what happens to jobs, and how do people create, if people are creating value, and you recognize the value, can you, quote, mint a currency that recognizes that, and that has some legitimate exchange value within a network?
Even if it's just exchange within that network.
Even within in the network. Right. And so, and that can be based upon a whole set of principles that can be governed by that community, that network. And my own view is I think we're going to have to transition to something like that, and it's a different kind of economy.
Very, very different. Yeah. So we're coming up on the end, but I want to throw one more question out to you. I'll give you a second to think about it. It's a two-part question, and each answer must be brief, because that means 4 parts. So the two-part question is, think about the future, the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. About your realm, makers, blockchain, what is one thing that concerns you, and what is one thing that excites you? So I'll give you a second to think about that, and I'll build on what was just stated. The real paradigm shift here that they both represent is a change in the structure of society, a change in human relationships, a change in corporations, institutions. A place like 1871 that Howard Tallman runs, and Howard's there with us, thanks for being with us. That type of organization, an ecosystem of startups all coming together with venture capital and lawyers and oh, heaven forbid lawyers, but yeah, they're there too, John. All these people within the ecosystem, that model didn't really exist 10 or 12 years ago. And we're seeing new models developing right now of social organization. The modern corporation was invented in order to deal with the stresses and opportunities of railroads and telecommunications, telegraphs, et cetera. So it was technology that drove a fundamental change in social organization, corporate structure, et cetera, and we're seeing the same thing going on now. So Dale, what's one thing that concerns you, one thing that excites you?
Well, I think the concern is that I think these things have the power to transform society if they just get pushed into the current boxes, like you just take making and you put it in school as a class, then I think you've lost its power to really change things.
But could it be a Trojan horse in that respect?
Oh, yeah, I hope so. And I think the students, are inside the horse, hopefully, or something's going on there. But initially it's asked, will this improve test scores? And it's obviously the wrong question to be asking. Will it engage kids in creating the future is the right question. The thing that excites me is it's this sort of notion of participatory culture and creative culture. Right. I think Maker Faire, like Burning Man and other things, are really asking people to get more involved in whatever it is they are passionate about. And I think that, not because there's necessarily a reward there, but because it's satisfying and meaningful. And I think people want purpose and meaning, and they want to belong to something. They want to belong to a community that cares about their work and supports it.
Great. John?
Okay, on the positive side, I think that positive and negative. I think that we're seeing systemic failures in traditional industrial democracy, and you have to be blind not to see that.
So you're a Trump voter.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, right. He's going to accelerate whatever is going to happen. And I'm not sanguine about
Fuel
that.
on the fire.
Yeah, so you really, I think we're in an age of major transition. You referenced the 1848, and you're going from a one kind of form of social organization, economic organization to another. And I think it is going to be decentralized. I think there's some really good ideas how to do that. On the positive side, if you look at, there's an event at Estonia, and I don't know if people are familiar with Estonia, this little tiny Estonia, is sort of the whole government as a platform. And then there was we were talking, we had some pretty radical ideas, talking to basically the Nordics and other, but all small countries that are very enlightened. And you have this sort of regulatory arbitrage going on to say, oh, we really want to do something new. We'll make the leap. And the Nordics are way ahead of where we are in thinking about this. So on the positive side of things, I think you can start to get traction on that. And I think these things can scale to a global transformation. That's a good side. That's a good side. On the dark side of it, I think that it can get captured. And that you have having been sort of in the internet forever, you have this idea of, can you really realize the dream of the internet being fully decentralized internet and networks and move up the social stack and do that without it being captured. And and so you have this tension about to fold it, something new and fold it into old boxes and contain it and capture it. And I think that's a tension.
Great. Well, Dale and John, you can all guess why I asked them here. But I also want to give them a thanks because in their own realms, they have been fundamental to my learning over the past few years. I had never honestly heard of Bitcoin maybe 3 or 4 years ago when we first met. You were one of the first people who shared that with me. And Dale, I had not really been exposed to this maker movement, so it's meaningful that you're here with us. Identity structures are changing. Decentralizing emergent networks aren't just for research. They're actually having impacts across all of our lives and industries. The kinds of problems we're trying to solve, Dale, that's a really good question. What are those problems? And I think the problems we should be trying to solve should be driven by the passions and interests of the people who are meant to solve them. In particular, as you mentioned, young people. Because that's how we're going to lift them up and show them that there's another way beyond the test, living beyond the test. And that learning rises to the challenges that Sam Petrotta and John Elliott were talking about earlier on to create and here's an interesting where you come together, the fear that John expressed of this being captured, the fear that you expressed of certain nefarious elements trying to hold it, or even those who aren't so nefarious, but just restricting this opportunity. Part of the solution might come from, Dale, your comment of participatory culture. How do we create a participatory culture? Thanks so much, Dale and John. This is great.